Hello, my name is Joel Block, and this is the first of 3 recordings that I'm making for the Flipping the Multilingual Writing Classroom for the SIG 2018 Writing Conference in Antwerp. I'm currently in Columbus, Ohio, or outside of Columbus, Ohio, recording this in my living room. And what I want to do is introduce what we're talking about by flipping the multilingual writing classroom. When you get to Antwerp, the class there is expected to be more of a discussion like a flip course. So it's hoped that you watch these videos before the course, and then we'll discuss many of the issues in the course, and you'll have time to work together to come up with your own ideas for how you would flip your classes. So let me begin. Right before I started recording this, I just received a video from John Bergman, who is one of the great popularizers of the idea of flipping classes, and he claimed that he doesn't like the term flip anymore, and so he's renaming everything reaching every student. And so I'm still going to use the term flip because that's still the more conventional term. But keep in mind that one of the changes, and I've really noticed this throughout composition theory, is that there's more of an emphasis on the nature of learning and the way students fit into this learning context, and so that the flipped classroom itself is part of that. And so let me first go over some of the issues that Bergman has raised about differentiating learning and providing autonomy. So he's really trying to develop new teaching strategies to fit into these classrooms. These strategies should promote what he calls authentic learning or active learning, and they're important in terms of reaching difficult to teach students. That's been one of kind of the emphasis in some of the webinars he's given. They're also about teaching what we call troublesome or difficult concepts, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. How making assignments social. So in this case, what we're trying to is more social interaction among the students in the flipped classroom. And of course they're interested in what new tools can be used. A lot of these from technology. Technology isn't a requirement, but there are a lot of tools and even furniture now that you can, depending on what kind of budgets you have, that you can implement in your classroom. Another issue, of course, is how to assess the students in the flipped classroom. Do you assess them in traditional ways by giving grades? Often this is defined by institutional requirements, or do you have the flexibility to come up with new ways of assessing? Portfolios is one that's often talked about. And probably one of the big issues that he's concerned with is what support do teachers need. Often in one of his seminars was entitled Flipping Alone, and I think a lot of teachers feel that they're on the cutting edge of pedagogy and that their colleagues aren't necessarily interested in following them and that they're working alone. So there's a lot of networks that have been created and organizations to support teachers, but some of the normal social interactions that teachers may have with their colleagues have not been as fruitful. A couple of issues that I wanted to add to that I was concerned with generally is how do students transfer knowledge across context. So, you can have different contexts for writing, and what is the relationship? Traditionally, we often looked at that meaning how to go from multilingual writing course to other writing assignments in the academy. I was looking at how you transfer across different modes of expression. I was particularly interested in integrating digital storytelling into the classroom and how that connects to academic writing assignments. And then one of the interesting things about the videos particularly is that how do you make this material accessible to students? And so some of the aspects of video making in particular have been important in terms of having students have subtitles, for example, or being able to view these as often as possible, or simply having sort of this alternate way of seeing things on a computer as opposed to listening in classroom. So what is it that we mean by flipped learning and flipped classroom? So the flipped classroom is, so there are questions to begin with is, what is it, a flipped classroom? How does flipped learning and flipped classrooms apply to writing? Most of the time traditionally it hadn't dealt with writing classes. They've dealt with really large science and math classes. What are the controversies in this approach? I am not an evangelical for flipped learning. I'm not really a member of any organization, and I try to look at this very critically. And my primary concern is how are course concepts integrated with flipping. And so each course is going to look different depending on what are the goals that teachers have for teaching. Bergman used the term that an operating system, which was, I think, an interesting concept. So that kind of goes against what often teachers feel is that the flipping it determines exactly what happens, whereas flipping is just creates a context for integrating other activities in the same way Windows might be a context for a word processing or for drawing or for any other kind of activities you do on your computer. So you can then create various activities, and this is what we're going to talk about. I have writing, tutorials, collaborating, videos, blogs, and so in some sense those were all existing activities that I had that I redistributed across different contexts, but also for many teachers they want to create new activities that they could integrate into the classroom. So there are 4 pillars traditionally of flipped learning. One is that learning is flexible. Again, you're trying to design the classroom so that it accommodates different types of students, students at maybe different levels or different approaches to learning. It creates a learning culture, and again, what it's done is it's focused a great deal on how students learn as opposed to how teachers teach. It involves a certain amount of intentional content. That is, what kind of materials do you need, and I'll talk about that later. And it also requires professional educators. So flipped learning is a sort of never stop learning process that you're never done with understanding it. And so there's a lot of networks, webinars, conferences that have been dedicated to flipped learning. Some of the links to that I put on the Google Docs page that's included with these videos. The idea of flipped learning is about designing, and one of the things I argue is teachers become designers. So in a sense, what you're deciding is what activities are you doing inside the classroom and what activities are you doing outside the classroom. This is going to impact both the roles of the teacher and student and the interaction between them. One thing I'm working on right now in my own research is to identify what's called threshold concepts, which are difficult areas of learning that might help students move between different courses or different modes of learning. In my class, for example, the 2 most important are textual borrowing and developing voice, which I see as being essential both to academic writing and the multimodal writing I do in my classroom. And then the flipped classroom reflects a certain amount of development of materials. I've curated a number of materials that I've included in the flipped book. I've created a lot of videos. You can also find videos on YouTube. You can repurpose videos. You can modify the videos. So there's a lot of material development. So and as will be argued, this is going to take some time, depending on how you do this, depending on how much time you have. There's lots of controversies. I've included a picture of the Gartner hype cycle, and for emerging technologies. And the flipped learning goes exactly in this area. You may be familiar now with Facebook, which 10 years ago was credited for being a kind of revolutionary tool, and now it's being criticized extensively. At some point in the area, kind of in the tail, is where it just levels off and people start figuring out exactly how to use it. And again, flipped classrooms are at a tremendous amount of hype that you have to kind of unpack. I'm sure there'll be a lot of disillusionment with the results. It's been difficult to prove exactly that these classrooms make better writers. But at some point, and I think particularly as more and more teachers come on board and there's more and more contributions, you'll see a more normal assessment of its potential. What outcomes are in the flipped writing that is, and again, it's a question of figuring out what outcomes. It may not be the same outcomes that were in a regular writing course. Accessibility, as I've said, is very big. Videos, the idea, of course, initially for flipped writing was to take large courses, chemistry courses, which in the United States can be 500-600 students, and get more accessibility. For multilingual students, for example, being able to watch the videos over and over again rather than once, having subtitles, which hopefully I'll be able to put on these videos, may help people learn with different modes. So there are a number of ways in which the flipped classroom can make materials more accessible. And of course there are costs. As with anything, technology is in this sort of phase where there are a lot of free technologies, a lot of technologies are looking for business plans. They go in and out of business. The first technology tool I used for creating videos went out of business. I had to find another one. Other technology tools, which used to be free, they're still free, but they're changing their terms of service to make it, trying to push you into buying subscriptions. The videos themselves can be cheaply made, or they can be very expensive, depends on how much equipment. So again, it is a matter of how much cost that you have. The same with accessibility. There are ways, for example, if your students don't access the video, now my students have lots of access, lots of ability to get online and the internet and to view videos, but not all students do, and you have to sort of redesign the class based on how much accessibility they have. So in the flipped classroom, what do we mean by interaction of teachers and students? There's a changing role of the teacher. There's a changing role for the student, and they become more learning orientated. What is the role of the teacher? I'm arguing that the role of the teacher is changing from being a sage and a guide to being a designer. There's lots of ways of designing things. There's what's called agile, where you design things on the fly, you're constantly redesigning. There's another way called waterfall, where you plan everything out. So finally, there's the question of what does classroom design look like in a flipped writing classroom? The primary focus is on the role of the teacher and student, and the idea is to expand the spaces for writing activities. What activities do you want to place where, and how do you want to deliver those activities? And then the ability to differentiating students so that all of them become active learners. Now, again, I look a lot at course videos. I do find them very important. They're not a requirement for flipped writing classrooms. It's just the way I've kind of designed it. The classrooms, the spaces, and all contain tools that I found useful for promoting different aspects of literacy and the writing process from the beginning to the end. So what we're trying to do then is create a technologically enhanced literacy space where students can discuss and write and work together to get complementary tools, and choosing which tools I can afford, which tools are appropriate for supporting the goals I have for the writing course. And then the goals then are to achieve greater autonomy, greater engagement, and greater interactivity for the writer. To return again to Bergman's operating system metaphor, it's not about the flipping or about the technology. It's about the goals for the writing classroom, what kinds of concepts you're focusing on in the classroom, what kinds of literacy activities do you think are appropriate for meeting those concepts, and then how are they placed? Where is the most effective way of placing those activities? So in conclusion, then, about the flipped writing classroom, it's a learner-centered classrooms with decentered teachers. There's a greater emphasis on classroom design and placing learning writing activities in different spaces. There is a question, depending on how much you want to integrate technology. Technology can have a very positive role in making materials accessible. One of the things to talk about, for example, for us is that all the materials that I've created are accessible not only to students but to anyone else. And so materials that used to be only in my classroom are now available everywhere. It's a combination of new and old activities, what I traditionally did in the writing classroom, and then anything new that you can come up with. Probably some of the issues are to get students and teachers on board. It's a process of both for students and your teachers to kind of understand how these changes can be beneficial. There's an idea of continual development, or what they call in software design perpetual beta, where you're always upgrading and changing what you're doing, and that requires constant learning on the teachers. And feelings of isolation, I don't want to overemphasize this. I've had a lot of trouble personally getting teachers on board, and they've resisted a great deal, and so you're often working alone, and therefore there's a kind of tendency of creating networks of teachers that you can interact with, but that's one of the issues. So in the upcoming videos, we'll look more at some of these issues that we discussed, and thank you, and I'll see you in Antwerp.